2,000 years ago, the dream of rotorcraft flight stirred deep in the human mind. Children in Jin Dynasty China sent that dream soaring with bamboo propellers, shielding their eyes from the sun while looking to the same sky we now navigate. The dream took a shape 1,000 years later when Leonardo da Vinci sketched his blueprint for the first VTOL flying machine. And in 1939, the dream left paper when Igor Sikorsky lifted off in Stratford, Connecticut. His flight touched down after just 3 seconds, but what it stood for never did. 5 years later, the first combat helicopter scraped the skies of a world at war, and 2 years after that, the Bell 47 was certificated for civilians, spinning up over a world pieced back together. It's been 80 years since then, but that dream of rotorcraft flights still takes lift in thousands worldwide who wish to make their way in and out of the cockpit. You would be hard-pressed to find in those 80 years someone as dedicated to that dream as our guest today. Tim Tucker began his helicopter journey more than 50 years ago. He didn't plan to join our industry from the start, but the most potent dreams often catch us unaware. Since 1982, Tim has served as Chief Instructor at Robinson Helicopter. He's established himself as an icon in the world of safety, and his vast experience makes him the perfect guest for our inaugural episode. We'll learn about Tim's roots in aviation, defined by his stint in the Vietnam War. He'll give us insights into his time at Robinson and expand on a design principle unique to Robinson helicopters. And if we listen closely, some of Tim's humble wisdom might stick with us to be applied when we need it most. This is Push to Talk with Bruce Webb. Episode 1. Better than digging foxholes.
If someone were to ask me about Tim Tucker, I would say not only a fantastic pilot, but a fantastic person and a safety advocate. And so welcome to the show, Tim. We're pleased that you're here today.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. Those are kind words.
Before there was a Robinson helicopter, Tim Tucker, what was Tim's story? What's your backstory?
Well, since I've been a pilot for over 50 years, 52 years now, that's going back a ways. It's kind of interesting. I learned to fly in the U.S. Army, but getting into the Army was somewhat a strange route. I graduated from college in 1969, and those of you who don't know 1969, it was a pretty volatile year on college campuses in the U.S. A lot of anti-Vietnam War protests going on. Kent State shooting was about to happen, hadn't quite happened yet. So as I say, it was a pretty volatile time. And I had held a deferment from being drafted throughout my undergraduate study. But when I graduated, I lost that deferment. And the only way you could continue that deferment was if you went into medicine. You could be a doctor or dentist, something like that. Or if you went into teaching, you're going to be a teacher. But if you're going to go on and go to law school or an MBA or anything like that, you were exposed to the draft. And I got drafted probably about 2 weeks after I graduated from college. Now, when you get drafted, you get given a period of time. It's about 10 days where you can go and enlist into whatever service you want to go into. And assuming you meet all the requirements, take the appropriate tests, you can actually pick a thing to do in the service. So, for example, if you want to drive tanks or you want to be a frogman or drive helicopters, whatever, as long as you meet all the appropriate requirements, take the appropriate tests, you can actually sign up for that. Or you can just be drafted. It's only a 2-year requirement, and you go where the military wants you or needs you, which at that time was typily the infantry in the Army.
Sure, absolutely.
I was right in that time, that 10-day, 2-week period where I had to choose whether I was just going to be drafted or actually, and I was back home. I was at a local pub, and I ran into a friend of mine who 4 years ago, we'd graduated from high school together. I went off to college. He went off to the Army and flew helicopters. We happened to meet in a bar one night, and he just thrilled me with these stories of flying a helicopter in Vietnam and convinced me that if you go to Vietnam, Tim, you definitely don't want to carry a gun on the ground. The only way to go is flying these helicopters. Now, I had never flown anything. In fact, I think I'd probably been on an airliner once or twice in my life at that point. But he just convinced me that seeing Vietnam from 1,500 feet was a whole lot better than
digging foxholes.
So the next day I went down to the recruiter and said, I want to be a helicopter pilot. They sent me for a flight physical, and I had to take it's called the FAST test, flight aptitude test, and pass all the things and got into flight school. Interestingly, on the FAST test, which is, as I say, a flight aptitude test, and the questions they ask you are trying to judge your aptitude for flying, and the minimum score is 70%. I got 70%.
Wow.
Had I got one of those questions wrong or not known exactly, which end was up on these tests, I
Fate
probably
is
would have gone on
interesting.
and done something else.
Sure.
But
So you enlisted, you were in the Army, you were already a graduate, so you were not a W-4? You went in as an officer? Or?
You could, I went around to all the services to check on being a pilot, Air Force, Navy, and the Army. The problem was that in the Air Force and the Navy, the commitment after flight school was 5 years. And in the Army, the commitment after flight school was 3 years. So that pretty much, that and the conversation I'd had with this friend kind of convinced me that the Army, because at the time, the difference between an airplane and a helicopter didn't mean much.
Right.
So I enlisted for warrant officer training. So you go through basic training for 8 weeks, and then you go to, at that time, Fort Walters, Texas, for the first 5 months of helicopter training, and then the last 4 months was at Fort Rucker, Alabama. And then you get 30 days leave and then right to Vietnam.
Wow.
Pretty much everybody in the class after class, went to Vietnam. Very unusual for someone to go some other place, Germany or whatever, Korea.
Of course. When you were at Walters, did you have your initial training in the Hillers or the Hughes?
In the Hughes. The way they did it was the taller people went in the Hillers, which is the Army designation with an H-23. It's really a Hiller 12, a civilian model. And then the shorter guys went into the TH-55, which is a Hughes A model 269.
Right. That's what I learned in. I'm not very tall either. That is awesome. So you were you did, how long were you in Vietnam?
So I was in Vietnam for a year, 12 months, which was a standard normal tour at the time. And when I came back from Vietnam at that time, the war was winding down, early 70s, and you could get out of the Army if you wanted to. But I decided to stay in for an extra year because they're requiring that everybody get an instrument rating. So I thought that might come in handy later on. So I stayed in for an extra year in order to get that instrument rating in the Army.
Wow.
So I was sent to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, 101st Airborne, and I spent another year there getting my instrument rating.
So when you deployed to Vietnam, then you were VFR only in the Hughes?
Correct. In flight school, you got, I'd say it was about 30 or 40 hours, and you got what the Army called a tactical instrument ticket. It wasn't a full instrument rating. It was just enough instrument training so that in hopes of inadvertently getting into an instrument situation, you had some idea of what to do to get out of it.
Right. You had some chance.
Yeah.
Not a great chance, but some chance.
Well, it ended up serving me well.
Yeah.
I
Tell us about that.
I did have an IMC occurrence in Vietnam, and it really it affected me, or has affected me, since my entire career, I think. It was a situation where I was a brand new aircraft commander. And typically, a brand new aircraft commander, they give you the missions for the first week, 2 weeks, something like that relatively easy, not much chance of too many bad things happening. So they kind of get used to running the show and being an aircraft commander. So I had this mission to fly from my base, which was in Pleiku in Two Corps, down to a city called Bambi Tuet. And I had to take these two American colonels just from one place to another. It's a pretty easy flight. However, it was in the rainy season, and the weather was pretty bad. However, in Vietnam, they taught us you either flew above 1,500 feet, because then you were you were out of small arms fire way, or if you couldn't do that, you flew real low, treetop level. And if you flew treetop level, you flew as fast as you could. And that's what they told us. So here the weather was bad. So, I'm flying about 110 knots, trying to follow this road, and came over a ridge line, and the weather just dropped down to the ground. And it was like a bullet just going into this fog bank. And so I jump on the instruments, and remember, there are two pilots here. Now, at this point, it'd probably been 6 or 7 months, maybe 8 months since my tactical instrument training in flight school. So I'm trying to bring all that back and develop a scan. My co-pilot, who had been to Vietnam less time than I, but had only been probably 3 or 4 months since his tactical time. Well, we started a climb, and it took both of us scanning the instruments to keep that helicopter right side up. And I can remember, I would be looking at 30 knots, and he'd say, airspeed, airspeed, airspeed. And then I'm looking at 110 knots and a bank left and bank right. And we just kind of nose high, nose low, steep turn left, steep turn right, kind of waddled our way up. And we broke out about 11,000 feet. And so there we are. It's VFR on top, beautiful day. And we always carried all the charts, instrument charts, en route charts with us, even though we'd never looked at them or never used them. So it took us a few minutes to dig those out. And at Bambi to it, they had an NDB approach. And I can remember talking with my co-pilot, do we fly this heading? And how long do we fly outbound? And will we make this procedure turn? When do we leave? And between the two of us, we kind of remembered enough to attempt this NDB approach. And you have to understand that NDB beacons in Vietnam were not real strong. So the needle would move maybe 10, 15 degrees left or right. So you just kind of had to pick the middle, and take it from there. So we kind of got down to what our procedure was going to be. We began tracking right towards the NDB and figured out how we were going to turn outbound and when we were going to begin a descent. And I can remember we'd probably been now VFR on top for 15 or 20 minutes getting to the NDB. And so I had a little bit of time to prepare myself and that type of thing. But I can remember as we turned outbound and I had to start a descent and go back into these damn clouds, I really was unsure what was going to happen. But between the two of us, we were able to make our way outbound. We did a procedure turn. We started inbound. And then we went through a hole, and I could actually see the jungle, probably 2,500 feet below me. So that's all I needed. Not enough of these clouds. So I rolled the throttle off, entered auto rotation, brought the speed back to about 10 knots, and we just went straight down in this hole. And I think the ceiling was probably about 600 or 700 feet. It wasn't that low. But as soon as we broke out, rolled that throttle back on and continued VFR. But the interesting thing, and I normally don't take the time to go through that whole story, but I think the interesting thing is that scared the living hell out of me so much that I have had a number of situations, 5, 6, 7 times during my career since then, where I've had a situation where landing the helicopter was, I'm not going to say the only option, but it was either land the helicopter or get into those clouds again. And even years later, when I've got quite a bit more instrument experience and flying in the clouds, I still wanted no part of that going inadvertently IMC. So I've landed, and to use the HAI's term now, landed and lived a number of times. And I think knowing what that initial IMC experience was like and how terrifying it was has made it much easier for me to, as I say, land the damn helicopter.
Absolutely. Well, we spoke about this yesterday or day before yesterday. There's a difference between knowing the danger and understanding the danger. And your experience took
Provides
you from
that
knowing
understanding,
to
yeah.
that understanding. And I think it's interesting that, there are those of us who've had encounters like that, who were fortunate enough to survive, and then that made an indelible mark and changed our behavior forward.
No question.
And so when you look at the how the world, there are defining moments in our lives that really change the future of your life. And, being drafted into Vietnam at the time that you were drafted, then you chose to go into the Army. That was, a defining moment in your life. And then later, with this event, it changed. I propose that you may not be here today had you not had that harrowing experience, because the first time you had that harrowing experience may have been in a civilian aircraft by yourself at night, in different conditions, and maybe you wouldn't have survived. Maybe I wouldn't survive. It was fate, if you will, that event happened. And like many things in life, I believe what looked to be something horrible at the time may have been the biggest blessing you've ever received.
Oh, no question about it. Well, certainly I think there are a number of experiences I've had, especially in a combat situation, where that can be true. But interestingly, I've gone on in the Army and not only got an instrument rating, but, have flown quite a bit, in the clouds, IFR, in an Army helicopter. But it's so much different when you plan an IFR flight, you get an IFR clearance, you fly that clearance, and then shoot and approach at the end. That's so much different than if you inadvertently punch in. And I think the helicopter industry in general, and that may be changing now, but certainly this is the way it was in the past. Everybody treated this instrument flying kind of as an emergency procedure. In other words, you try to stay VFR, VMC as long as you possibly can. But if you inadvertently punch in, or if you get to a point where you choose to punch in, you hope all these instrument skills that you've taught come rushing back to you, and you're able to deal with this inadvertent IMC situation. And in most cases, that's not going to happen.
The data supports that.
Yeah, and so, look at airplanes. Airplanes, you file an instrument flight plan, you get a clearance, and, you fly that route and then shoot and approach. We in the helicopter world, we have very little of that type of instrument flying going on. Perhaps some of the offshore areas in the world, they do it. But other than that, it's not the norm at all. We use this instrument rating and this instrument training we've gotten as an emergency procedure. And that just gets people into trouble.
Right, I agree 100%. And when we think about it from a instrument standpoint, if you are shooting like your NDB approach or any non-precision approach, they're going to drop you off somewhere around 400 feet above the surface. Most helicopter pilots are not punching in inadvertent IMC at 400 feet above the surface. Unfortunately, they're punching in at somewhere between 200 and 400 feet probably. And so they're already lower than you can legally fly a fixed wing IMC. In other words, if you shoot an approach. So, yeah, I find that fascinating that, I guess we first started flying helicopters civilly in this country in 1946, summer of 46. The Bell 47 was certificated. And since that time, of course, we weren't flying those IMC, but since that time, we've had way too many accidents because people do find themselves, they place themselves in situations where they're either forced to land and live or proceed in the clouds. And after you've been in that situation, you're a great example of that. You yourself have made several land and live decisions, not continuing and punching in. Even though you're instrument rated, instrument capable, and probably more competent than many aviators in that arena. But you choose not to.
Correct. And I think, I remember, probably 10, maybe 15 years ago, as a pilot examiner, a lot of people were coming to me for helicopter instrument tests. And in many instances, it might have been an EMS company wants all their pilots now to have instrument ratings, or somebody wants to get an instrument rating to qualify for a job at one of these emergency medical companies. And I kept thinking, this whole idea of people getting an instrument rating, it's going to somehow help them a year down the road some night, and they've just gone to a scene to pick up some people, and now they need to get back to the hospital, and they inadvertently punch in that this instrument rating that they got 12 months ago, 18 months ago, was actually going to help them here. And I think it's actually had the opposite effect. It won't help them at all, but it might give them the confidence or the overconfidence to perhaps do something or take a flight further because I've got an instrument rating.
It may embolden them.
Yeah, I have an instrument rating, so I can, and nothing could be further from the truth.
Correct. And when we look at the empirical data, the accident statistics, when we look at fatal accidents, at least over the past 20 years, there's no correlation between having an instrument ticket and not having one with respect to fatal accidents. In other words, an equal number of those persons who are deceased had instrument tickets. So I think the numbers bear out what you've seen, that it's not going to stop you from harming yourself potentially.
And I think the pilots that do fly helicopters on instruments on a regular basis have an understanding that actually being IMC in the clouds is so much different than just wearing a hood, having a safety pilot next to you, clear blue, sunny day, and you have a hood on. That's a different thing than actually being IMC in the clouds. So people who may have said, well, I'm current, I've been flying, but they've been flying with a hood on, sunny day with a safety pilot, sometimes an instrument instructor next to them. It's a whole different animal than actually going into the clouds. Even if you're on an IFR flight plan, I remember many times punching into a cloud in the IFR where those first half a minute, maybe a minute, you spend that time really zeroing in on that cross-check and getting comfortable flying in the cloud. And it takes a little bit of time to make that transition, even when you know it's coming, when you plan for it. So if you inadvertently or surprisingly punch in, you just got your hands full.
And you're anxious. In other words, most of us are not flying in clear blue and 22, very calm, very relaxed, and then the next moment we're inadvertently IMC. It is a buildup, and the buildup is, if you had a pulse oximeter on yourself, I'm sure you would see that your heart rate is very rapid. Your O2 saturations are descending. They're getting lower. You're not making good decisions. You're anxious, a lot of adrenaline, and all of that leads to, well, unfortunately, crashes.
Yeah. I don't know who's a famous pilot said this. I can't recall his name right away, but he said once, we all have limited mental capabilities, and this situation will require all of it. You ever heard that before, Bruce?
I have, yeah. I appreciate that, Tim. And my capabilities are very limited, but I do think that we can overestimate our capability and our mental capacity. We know it's fascinating, and we're designed to be this way. Humans are designed this way. If someone
especially pilots.
Yes, especially pilots. We know our physical limitations. None of us are going to go out, and you nor I are going to walk outside right now and run a 4-minute mile. It isn't going to happen, and we know that. But if someone were to say, hey, can you do X? Can you do this mental computation? Oftentimes we overestimate what we can do.
Sure. But that's almost the nature of the beast with pilots. They're all, type A type people. I remember in Vietnam, we'd have missions that the requirement was you had to volunteer for it. And everybody volunteered. In fact, we get into arguments. You got to go last time. I get to go this time,
Right.
kind of thing. It's kind of almost the nature of the beast. I remember I've heard Frank Robinson say this many times. He calls pilots, they're prima donnas. I can't stand hiring a pilot. They're all prima donnas.
Well, he hired a good one when he got you, that's for certain. It is very true. This was back during Katrina, which was now, oh my gosh, Katrina was almost 20 years ago. It was 2005, I believe, Katrina. We were flying, and I remember Frank, I won't say his last name, but a fantastic pilot, friend of mine. Frank, we were flying down there, and I said, listen, we got to stop. And he's like, no, I can do it. We can keep going. And I said, no, we've been flying like 15 hours. It's now, midnight, and we got to stop. And from that point previously and subsequent to that, it made me think, I've never had a pilot ever tell me they can't. If you ask someone, you could go out onto the flight line after someone's flown 15 hours in a combat zone and say, hey, listen, I need someone to do X. And probably every pilot will say, pick me.
Yep, I totally agree.
Even when they're fatigued beyond belief, but again, it goes back to how we mask from ourselves our mental capacity, our level of alertness, because there's no way none of us are as sharp after 5, 10, 15, 12, pick the number. When we're fatigued, we're fatigued. And so you've had many occasions in your career to fly some missions which were volunteer only. And so can you share any of those with us? I do know that you have earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, or multiple ones. So would you be kind enough to share a story with us about that? I think that's something people don't know, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I think it's fascinating.
Sure. I hate to get into telling war stories, but I think, I've got a list of them, or that I could go through. But I think the context was probably important. The unit I was in Vietnam had a specific mission where we took long-range reconnaissance patrols outside of Vietnam, across the Laotian border into Laos, and would insert them anywhere from maybe 20 to 40 miles inside of Laos along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And their mission was, somewhat varied. Either just look for troop concentrations, or, count troops and equipment moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Sometimes it was a prisoner snatch to gain intelligence. We would insert them, and then we'd go back to a base just inside of Vietnam and wait. And if they got into contact, into problems, then we would have to go get them. And typically when we went to get them, they couldn't choose the landing place. So they were where they were. And it was thick triple canopy jungle in the area. So my unit, long before I'd gotten there, had developed this technique using either 40-foot ladders or 110-foot, we called them strings, but they're 4 strings through that come out of each side of the UE, and the people on the ground would wear these McGuire rigs that kind of went through their crotch up around, and they had 2 D-rings up on their shoulders. And the string came down, and there was a horizontal bar that they would just clamp these D-rings to, and we would just lift 4 people out of the jungle. And
so the teams were teams of 4?
Teams of 4. And so if there were 8 on the ground, then we'd use 2 extraction ships. And every time we went into Laos, we always took 6 Hueys and 4, when I was there, Cobra gunships. And we would typically have either 2 Navy A7s or Air Force F4s that were on station in case any of their firepower was needed. And the way we worked it is, of our 6 Hueys, ships 1, 3, and 5 were the extraction ships. Ship 2, 4, and 6 were only there in case 1, 3, or 5 got shot down. So ship 2 was responsible for ship 1. So if ship 1 got shot down, it was up to ship 2 to get that crew out. Same thing for 4 was responsible for 3. And the whole mission would be is if you got above the jungle, which was typically maybe 200, 250 feet high, but your strings were only 110 feet high. So you would have to hover down into the jungle to get close enough to where the strings would work. So between the door gunner and the crew chief on the left and right-hand side of the helicopter and the co-pilot sitting in the right seat, you'd be on top of the jungle and the crew chief would tell you to either come down 10 feet, then move the helicopter 5 feet to the left, slide to the left, bring the nose 10 degrees to the right, and now come down. And you just slowly work your way through the jungle. If you needed to chop a tree down or a branch down.
It sounds unhealthy for the blades.
You just, you'd be amazed what a UH-1 rotor blade can do. I've seen it chop trees down that are probably 3-4 inches in diameter. And you finally get yourself down low enough to where the strings would reach. And so the crew would deploy the strings, guys on the ground would hook on. And then you have to make that same route back up through the jungle. And once you got to the top of the jungle, now you've got these people 110 feet below you. So you have to get 110 feet above the jungle to be able to then go into your takeoff. And that's when you are the most exposed. We kind of liked being down in the jungle because even though the bad guys could hear you and a lot of shooting going on, they couldn't see you. So they're just shooting at noise. And of course they could get lucky, but when you were exposed above the jungle trying to get the team out, now anybody with a clear shot at you could take aim. So that was always the tricky part. And then we would climb up to 6,000 feet, depending on the location, and have a 30, 40-minute flight back to South Vietnam.
I cannot imagine.
With these guys dangling below all the time. And it was, all the pilots wore these McGuire rigs because if you got shot down, there was a good chance that's how you were going to be rescued. So one of our qualifications for new pilots, and we think we did this on probably a quarterly basis where you had to actually go on the strings yourself. But we treated it as a fun thing. We had, we as a ride, and we'd always dump the new pilot into the local river for, but it was, actually we enjoyed it and look forward to a ride on the strings. But in the combat situation in Laos, it was,
so it was missions like this that allowed you to earn your Distinguished Flying Cross?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I'm certain every listener will be very impressed.
And this is the kind of thing that we didn't do it once or twice. This would be a 3 or 4 times a week, week in, week out affair. So it got to be fairly standard.
So I can't help but sit here and think that you're a man who 30 minutes ago was telling us that when you went inadvertent IMC, it was frightening. It made an impact upon you.
Definitely, yeah.
But doing what you were doing. So I guess what strikes me is that doing something that most people would consider to be the ultimate risky thing, right? Placing your aircraft in harm's way for many, many minutes to extract people made it less of it wasn't as frightening to you as being in those clouds for a few minutes.
Well, I think, of course, the whole combat thing is different. And I mean, that's an environment in and of itself. And the rules are different. The risks you'll take are different. And it's just a different world. Whereas the IMC experience, I mean, there's an experience that actually translates into other flying that I've done, since Vietnam. And so as I say, it translates, I think, fairly well. Where the combat situation, that's fairly unique.
Yes.
And
I'd say fairly
like
unique.
I say, it's got its own set of rules.
Right.
Well,
thank you for sharing that. I know that you're a humble person, so I know that that's not something you typically talk about, but I think it's something that people are interested in. So thank you for sharing that with us. Let's take a few minutes and come back to something more current. So Robinson Helicopter, I mean, when someone says Robinson helicopter, I think the follow-on is Tim Tucker, or the precursor is Tim Tucker, at least from a pilot standpoint. And again, I know Tim doesn't recall, but actually Tim and I flew together. It was probably, I don't know, I will say 1987. I could go back in a logbook and look, but I went to the Robinson safety course. Actually, I'd been flying an R-22. I was flying a standard. And then I flew some Alphas and Bravos, and ultimately we had a customer purchase a Bravo, or maybe it's an Alpha. I'd have to go back and look. I can't remember. And so we became a Robinson Service Center, and then that necessitated, to be a service center, that we had to send technicians to training, which was fantastic, and I went to pilot school. So Tim doesn't remember. I wouldn't expect him to. I had hair back then. But I flew with Tim in an R-44 or an R-22 Mariner. It was Frank's Mariner. And that's what we did our training in, was in Frank's Mariner. So anyway, it's a small world. So tell us the beginnings of Robinson from your perspective. So when you joined Robinson, what were you thinking?
What happened is I saw in the mid-'70s, myself and four other guys, we owned an airplane flight school. We had 20 some odd airplanes, and we're doing airplane trainings. And I saw an ad, or not an ad, it was a story in the Los Angeles Times about this fella up on the Palos Verdes Peninsula that was designing this small light helicopter. And even though I was teaching airplanes, I was a frustrated helicopter instructor at the time. So I went and visited him, and I saw his prototype. And make a long story short, we put a deposit down on the first one that they made. Obviously, where I was located was about 5 miles from Torrance Airport, Long Beach Airport, and Robinson wanted to have those first few helicopters as close to home as possible, because they were the ones who were going to do the maintenance. It would be kind of strange to have the first helicopter, say, on the East Coast, and the East Coast operator calls up and says it's making this noise, or I've got this vibration. Troubleshooting would be difficult from a transcontinental standpoint. So he wanted the helicopters close. So we put a deposit down, and we took delivery of the first production helicopter, serial number 3. Serial number 1 was the original R-22. It first flew in 1975. However, it crashed about halfway through the FAA approval program, went into the Pacific Ocean where we did most of our flight testing, sunk, spent 3 days at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. So when they finally found it and pulled it up, it was no good anymore. So the company built serial number 2, which was then used to complete the FAA certification program. And serial number 3, the one I purchased, was the one that was used to get the production certificate. There's kind of 2 steps or 2 stages to this whole approval program. First, to get the design approved, and that's the type certificate. But then you have to demonstrate to the FAA that you can build the helicopters to the same specification that the design calls for.
Meet conformity.
And that's a production certificate. So the one I bought was the one that was used to get the production certificate. So we then, that was serial number 3. We also operated serial number 4. And so we were the first operators. We had a flight school at Long Beach, and at the time, I think the going rate for helicopter training then was about anywhere from $130 to perhaps $150, typically in a Bell 47 or a Hughes 300. So when we came on in late 1979, we charged $48 an hour.
Wow.
And so pretty much, 70% discount off the normal training rate. And as you might imagine, we were jammed. But then the helicopter had some issues with blades, and as you might expect a new helicopter to have. But as I say, it's been a wild ride that Frank Robinson has certainly produced, and I've been along for the whole ride.
Absolutely, yeah, fantastic machine. So I as I recall, so I may be incorrect, Tim, but I believe that the original ships, the standards, and maybe I think only the standards, the blades were manufactured out of house. And then he brought blade manufacturing in-house to resolve some of the issues that they had with the blades.
Yeah, well, actually, the components of the blades were manufactured at Robinson, but the bonding process was done outside of Robinson. And the first blade problem was a bonding problem.
Sure.
And so Frank brought that whole bonding issue or
process
back into the factory where it's been ever since.
Right. And I don't think they had any debonding. The trailing edges debonded on some of the first aircraft that he didn't bond.
Right. We had trailing edge bonding issues, which really isn't going to cause a problem. But then they had a debonding on the leading edge, which actually caused a problem. Blade failed and killed 2 people.
Right. But after when Robinson took control of all of it, I don't believe there's ever been another issue.
No, that's right. That's correct.
I mean, that's a testament. If anyone listening that's not been to the Robinson facility, it is impressive. I mean, to say the least, it's impressive. And I don't know all the statistics. Perhaps the host should know, but I think the R-22s, the R-44s, the R-66s, certainly if you add them together, they've outsold any other helicopter model, single model in the history of helicopters. Is that true?
Well, I think when you take away military sales, that's probably true.
Yeah, it's been fantastically successful. I probably have only, I don't know, I might have 300 hours in R-22s, probably mostly standards and then a little in the other alphas and betas, but maybe an hour in an R-44, and I've only seen an R-66, so I'm really not I'm not even an amateur, but my experience with the ship has always been fantastic. And people will be critical of the cyclic configuration, and they say, "Well, that's a ridiculous configuration." And I believe I know why it was designed that way, and I've never had any issue with it. But can you shed light on why Frank chose to do it that way, to have a central cyclic?
I'll just preface this discussion by saying that Frank, or Robinson Helicopter Company, actually has a patent on the T-bar cyclic design. And the purpose of the T-bar cyclic design is to increase the amount of lateral cyclic control available to the pilot. You know, the R-22, it's fairly narrow, so when you sit in it, your legs are fairly close together. So if you had the standard cyclic that came up between your legs, the lateral cyclic would be limited by your 2 legs. And that would mean that the control power or the sensitivity of that cyclic would be quite high. So by having the handle come up and be able to pass over your legs, you actually increase the total cyclic travel by about 11 inches, which desensitizes the lateral cyclic control, which is the number one reason for the T-bar cyclic. Some additional benefits are by just having one set of control linkages that saves weight, it saves on maintenance, and a few less parts that can break. So there are some benefits, but to desensitize the lateral cyclic control is the number one reason. And that's especially true in the R-22. Now, when we get to the R-44, it's probably less true because the cockpit is wider in the R-22, and certainly that's true in the R-66. But the design was kept in the R-44 because the R-44 is, for all intents and purposes, just a big R-22. From a design standpoint, it's pretty much the same helicopter. But we found now there's some added benefits to the T-bar cyclic control. It makes getting in and out of the helicopter much easier. There's not a cyclic coming up out of the floor. I know if anybody's ever gotten into the front seat of a MD-500, you have to almost be a contortionist, especially on a high skid gear, to work your way into that seat. So it makes getting in and out of the helicopter much easier. And plus, and it takes a little bit of getting used to, but once one gets used to that T-bar cyclic and they move over into the instructor's side, now actually taking the flight controls or the cyclic from the instructor is quite a bit easier because you actually pull the cyclic handle down and the corresponding cyclic handle for the student comes out from the top of his hand. So they're not set up to resist that, as though if you tried to rip it out of their hands laterally or longitudinally, they could resist that. And if you have a student that freezes, then that's going to be bad. So it makes it easier to actually take the controls away from the student. So that's a number of reasons there why the design has stayed with.
Right. Well, I can say that my thigh has limited my lateral cyclic displacement on many occasions and on other aircraft, unfortunately. And the R-22, when its initial concept was not as a training aircraft, was it? Is that true?
That's correct. Yeah, it was supposed to be a personal use.
And Frank used it that way. He flew his own aircraft.
Sure.
Forever. I mean,
not quite down to the market to get a gallon of milk, but certainly he would go off on trips and land at hotel parking lots or things like that.
And I think a lot of the innovation may be an exaggeration, but a lot of the modifications, when he felt like something was not quite right or something could be improved, I mean, it was from his own use of the aircraft, allowed him to have a better understanding of what his consumer was experiencing.
Yeah, not only that, he would be the one to test a lot of the new systems or things that would go on there. And he'd normally sometimes, let's say, the air conditioner or the hydraulics, things like that. He would put it on his personal ship first and fly it on his personal ship for a period of time before he was happy with it and say, okay, now we'll go into production with it.
Right, outstanding. From my recollection, Robinson is the only helicopter company which has actually gone to the regulators and said, hey, listen, we'd like to tighten some things up. We've got a flight manual that allows, we have limitations in our flight manual, but we want to tighten some things up. And Robinson went to the authorities, the FAA, and worked with the FAA to add some additional regulations to the operation of the aircraft. What's been your experience with that process?
Well, are you talking about SFAR 73?
Sure. Yep.
Well, I tell you, Bruce, the whole evolution of SFAR 73, it's probably too much of a story or an explanation to go into now. I will just plug my website, Tim Tucker's Helicopter World, because I have written a fairly long explanation of, I call it the story behind SFAR 73, that goes into the, for want of a different word, battle between the NTSB and the FAA at the time, with Robinson right in the middle trying to please both. So it takes quite a bit of explanation from both the NTSB standpoint, the FAA standpoint, and then, little old Robinson Helicopter Company in the middle of those two entities fighting it out. And then the end result of that battle between those two government agencies was Special FAR 73. So people think Robinson went to the FAA to get it, and that's not the case at all. This was certainly forced on Robinson. Now, Robinson did have some input, but it was going to be forced on them whether
I didn't realize that.
Whether they wanted it or not. And so obviously if you're going to get hit with a bunch of regulations, if you can influence what the numbers are going to be, what the things you can do and can't do are, you should. And that's what Robinson did. But it certainly was forced on him, no question about that.
What year was that? I don't recall. It's been a long time ago.
That would have been the mid-'90s, probably 96, 95, 96.
Yeah, it happened after actually I had kind of stopped flying them for whatever reason. So interesting.
Well, as I say, with the experience requirements that are in there, Robinson is all for. In fact, we think in many instances, the FAA experience requirements for certain things should be revised. And
we've, unfortunately, again, it's back to human behavior. We look at the regulations and people say, oh, you only need 40 hours to get a private rating, 20 dual, 20 solo. Then that becomes the goal. That is not necessarily what someone believes the value should be. It's the minimum. So that's the shortest length of time an aviator can obtain a certificate. It's not necessarily what is recommended or what's realistic.
Sure. And if you go back to the early days of the R-22, it right off the bat was used primarily as a trainer. So Frank's idea that it's going to be an individual, personal, private, really didn't come until later on. It was used almost entirely as a trainer. And we had two types of instructors that were teaching in the R-22 in those early days. First, we'd have fellows like myself that had come out of the U.S. military. In many cases, we had thousands of hours of flight time, but all of those hours were in big helicopters. And this was our first experience in a small, light, quick, low-inertia rotor system. And needless to say, since there's no FAA requirement, make and model requirement for an instructor, we had a lot of people that used to these big, slower responding machines had a difficult time. The other part of the instructors were airplane instructors that were coming out of the airplane world into the helicopter world. It was not unusual at that time for the local Cessna Pilot Center or Piper dealer. They wanted to get into the world of helicopters. They bought one of these little R-22s. They'd take one of their experienced airplane instructors, get them at that time 25, and then it went to 50 hours in the helicopter. They got their commercial add-on, and then a few more hours, and they got their instructor add-on. And so there they are with 60, 70, maybe 80 hours of total helicopter time, and now they're teaching people to fly in this R-22. So those are the two instructor camps that we had. And so we tried to use SFAR 73 to address what we had always felt was we wanted more make and model time for instructors.
Yes. I think that it's not uncommon, unfortunately, in our industry to hear people say some disparaging things, or they'll say, oh, you're a Robbie pilot, or oh, you're a... And quite honestly, anyone who knows me has heard me say, listen, if you're a competent pilot in an R-22, you can fly anything. I mean, the ship, it's what, I think it's 1370 is the gross mass. Hell, that's less gross mass than most fuel loads on a light single.
And the standard that you flew was 1,300.
It's human behavior. Little does not mean not good. And flying bigger ships doesn't make you better. And the Robinson's been a fantastic helicopter, and I think it's a testament to American ingenuity and perseverance and adaptation. You know, Robinson, the helicopter company, is doing fantastic. I know that it is, but it's not always been that way. I mean, every company struggles over time, and the fact that it's here today is tremendous. It's fantastic. So one of the things that's helped Robinson succeed is their commitment to aviation safety. So Robinson started their safety program, their training, almost at the onset, did they not? Or when did that begin, Tim?
Our first safety course was in late 1982, and you're right. We saw right off the bat we had a lot of accidents with training, with instructors on board. So the safety course was set up for instructors. You had to be an instructor to get into it, and it was geared towards instructors. How to teach certain maneuvers, common student errors, techniques, that type of thing. But it was geared specifically to instructors. And through the insurance industry, we tried to get, first we went to the FAA to try to get them to increase the make and model experience and for instructors. But needless to say, that whole regulatory process is so time-consuming that we went to the insurance industry and we got them to buy into higher time requirements for instructors, higher time requirements to solo for a student. And also one of the requirements from an insurance standpoint was to attend the flight instructor course at Robinson. We were the first helicopter course to get approved by the FAA as a flight instructor refresher course, and we've maintained that up until recently. So our whole course was originally geared towards a flight instructor. And by the probably late 80s, there was a lot more personal private type flying being done. The R-44 was about to come out. So we opened the course up to all pilots and changed the curriculum a little bit to more gear it towards all pilots. And that's the way it's been since the late 90s. I think the last time they've added it up, I think we've had over 22,000 pilots.
Wow. I was going to ask how many people have been through that.
The safety course. And that's just the course at the factory. And then we've also held quite a few foreign safety courses.
And you participate in many of those, or did in the past?
Yeah, I pretty much did them all. In fact, we did, last count, I think we've done 122 foreign safety courses in 30 different countries around the world, 57 different cities, which has been a fantastic experience for me to go around the world and to fly in all these different places around the world. So I've got, I think I've got 17 foreign pilot's licenses.
That's awesome. You had to have for their requirement to provide instruction there.
Yeah. Now, most of them are temporary. They would only be good for the time that I was in the country, in 2 weeks or a month or something like that. And so every time I'd go, I'd have to get a new one.
That's fascinating. So what's the most unique place you've provided training? If you had to, just what pops in your mind when I say the most interesting spot in the world, a yurt in, Mongolia? I mean,
well, that's a difficult one because there's so many different levels you can address that on. Certainly one of the most unique ones was in Rwanda, Kigali, Rwanda. The Rwandans were taking pilots and teaching them in, I believe they got about 200, I could be wrong on that, hours in an R-44. I guess I got 400 hours in an R-44. And then they would transition into either a Mi-8 or an Mi-17. I think the Mi-17's got a gross weight of 25,000 pounds or something. So that's quite a transition that they would do. So we did a safety course in Rwanda. And not so much the flying, although that was fairly interesting too, but I got to go on a gorilla trek where
Really?
the gorillas in Central Africa, and that was absolutely amazing.
did you meet Jane Goodall?
No, but we're in the same area.
Really?
We're in the area that she was in, and saw her grave, and
Fascinating. Yeah, she had a fascinating story.
it was quite an experience to be 10 feet from 6 or 7 of these silverback gorillas. Amazing.
That's the so that's a far cry from the jungles of Laos.
Yeah, certainly.
I mean, who could have imagined? So as you sit here today, if you were to share one piece of advice to a new helicopter pilot, what would it be?
Well, that's a good question. I get asked variations of that question, frequently. But I think it's most important for pilots to maintain a very healthy respect, tinged with a little bit of fear, for this tremendously varied world that a helicopter pilot can operate in. I think a little fear in the back of your mind aids in good decision-making and adds some discipline to your actions. We fly machines, and machines break. And we fly these machines in an environment that's not natural for us. I mean, we're not birds. Right? But as soon as you think that you have total control of your machine or your environment and allow some complacency to seep in, this helicopter world will rise up and take a big bite out of your ass, the size of which you may not be able to survive. So I would tell pilots to conduct a good pre-flight, use the checklist, check the weather, read your POH, and appreciate this world that they've entered and give it the respect it not only deserves, but requires.
That is sage advice from truly an icon in this industry. So, I think if we can convince people to heed that, Tim, we will have a significant reduction in helicopter accidents. I thank you. I thank you very much. So I appreciate your time, Tim. It looks like we've reached our clearance limit. I'd like to thank you again for not only your time, but your insight and your safety advocacy.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and I appreciate the opportunity. And everyone, just fly safe.
Thank you. Until next time, resume own navigation, and remember that unable does not mean incompetent.
The information provided during this podcast, Push to Talk with Bruce Webb, is made available for general information and educational purposes only. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily represent those of Airbus Helicopters, Inc. or its affiliates.